This is the Generative AI Taskforce at the TUM Think Tank, bringing together a diverse team of experts and researchers who provide guidance to decision makers in government, industry, and civil society on issues related to the design, governance, and use of generative AI technologies. Today we're speaking with Ingo Weber, who is both at the TUM School of Computation, Information and Technology and is also Director of Digitization and ICT Infrastructure at the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft. In his research, he focuses on service management, development and operations. So it's good to have you today. Thanks for being on the podcast. And I want to start right away with my first question for you, which would be where you see the greatest potential or use cases of generative AI in your field.
Sure. Thanks for having me, first of all. I will give you answers with regards to two separate views. The one is with me as a scientist coming from backgrounds in business process management, software architecture, engineering, but also with a view on data science and scientists in general. And the latter has to do with my Fraunhofer role, where I'm, of course, in a position where I need to make the best of these developments, bring these kinds of innovation into Fraunhofer, make them, if possible, if valuable, make them productively usable for the whole of Fraunhofer, which is like 30,000 scientists. With regards to the software architecture, business process management and data science, there are a number of different views that I have, so improvements that will become possible. So one of the main aspects of these conversational interfaces, which are possible through generative AI, is that we can have language interfaces that hold context. And so we basically can go away from one-size-fits-all solutions and have more sort of context-specific interfaces where users can ask questions and then dig into details where they are interested in it, given their specific context. So be that process execution, process context, process analysis, understanding different steps of a process, or be that generally interfaces of software, right? For example, if you think about using a search engine for flights and hotels, you might know a lot of the filters of the options that are given there to you, but it might be you might not know some, and then you can ask details about them. How does this work? And then hopefully get to a better understanding of the software that you're using, a better context-specific solution for you. So that's the user side, but there's also the developer side, the architecture and engineering side of all of these systems, data science, business processes, generally software, and engineers and the architects, they can use generative AI to become more productive. So can have it write code, fix bugs in the code with large language models, maybe implement improved business processes more quickly, or maybe ask it to write code for data analysis. Right? And so we will see people who are currently not able to do as much, be able to do much more in that sense. Case in point, I know somebody who has studied business administration and is now working as a developer using GPT 4.0, right?
Oh, there you go.
Exactly. So generative AI in science, we can use it for increased productivity and for increased quality. I think for many people who work in research and science, they know that not all research publications are written equally well and always equally understandable. And so in future, scientists can use AI-based systems to perform literature research in a way that goes far beyond keyword-based search, right? So in the current system, or systems, there is a weakness, which is you already have to know the terminology in order to be productive in finding the literature on a topic. And then what we see is that science fields that are, in terms of what they do, they are somewhat closely related, but in terms of the technology they use, they're quite different. And so if you're from the one field, you might not find literature from the other field, even though they use very similar concepts, just because they use different terminology. And so we can get beyond that in the future. And there are many productivity use cases that we can see in science, such as, you're editing a long document, say your doctoral dissertation, 300 pages, and you want to make sure that the terminology is aligned across the 300 pages, that you're introducing terms before you first use them, et cetera, et cetera. And that is, if you do that manually, and that is months of work, and not the most interesting work, of course. Then what you will also know is that you write a research publication and then somebody asks you to present about it. Or you start with a presentation, right? You come up with a slide deck saying, oh, this is the idea of the research I want to do. And then you start working on it and later on writing a paper. So we have these two different forms of media which are very much involved in research output, slide decks and written publications. And so switching between the one and the other and keeping, like editing the one but keeping the other up to date, I think we can gain a lot of productivity there. No longer spending, I don't know, how much time do you spend on creating a slide deck?
Too much time.
Well, there you go.
That would be well appreciated.
Or let's say what's very common in computer science, you have to write a paper and it has to be 15 pages. But you wrote the first draft and it's 20 pages. How do I get down 5 pages without losing too much information? And I think that's something that those use cases and quite a few more are some that generative AI can really help us.
Yeah, so great editor in your pocket.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then from these use cases onto the challenges.
Yeah.
Where do you see the most prominent challenges in your field then?
So in terms of software and code, I would say that there's a massive challenge in that not everybody may comprehend the output that they're getting, right? Let's say you're having a generative AI produce 200 lines of code, and what it does exceeds your level of knowledge. How do you know that it's correct, and how are you able to estimate what the side effects may be? And maybe we have a different AI for answering that question. But you see, this is definitely a challenge. This is also for data science, right? Like if I have a generative AI write a Python script for me that looks at my data, let's say as a manager, and then I draw the wrong conclusions from that because the way the data is analyzed with this Python script gives me a result that is different from what I expect, right? And then based on that, I might make the wrong decisions. So those are definitely challenges. And for lack of a better word, if the AI in certain areas is more intelligent than the user, right, then I think that's a problem. Similarly, in terms of science, if the level of output exceeds what the user understands, comprehends themselves, how can they be certain about what they actually put in a presentation or in a publication? There's another challenge that I want to highlight, which is quite dear to my heart in this topic, which is we're used to computers being like calculators, being precise, being correct. Now we have imprecise machines, right? Artificial intelligence in general, but generative AI specifically, they're imprecise, and there's a massive challenge in educating the users to understand the implications of that. And I don't know if you ever used generative AI to produce some text, let's say, as a draft for a publication or for an idea, right? It comes up with beautiful references and very well written arguments, but it might be completely wrong. and the references might be invented.
Yeah, I had that case. I've tried it out for research, and then it gave me references that sounded great because the researchers were actual researchers in that field, and they had also published in that paper. But there's no such article. And if you ask it then, or I asked ChatGPT then, like, hey, where did you find that? Could you give me a link? And it said like, oh, whoops, I'm sorry. And then apologized and then made up another, oh, this might be the one that I was referring to, and then hallucinated. And I thought that was interesting because you tend to just believe what it says, right? Because it's well articulated and you just believe it's another Google, but it's actually not, right?
It's very far from that.
Yeah.
And now this is the point where it does not mix well with science, right? Because the value of science comes from the integrity of the process and putting the best information that we have in our papers, being honest about that, everything, right? And this does not mix so well with generative AI that, at least for the moment, still hallucinates quite a bit.
Yeah. So let's see if we can use it then in the future.
Yeah. Some other challenges that I just want to raise and not go into a lot of detail. Confidentiality, if you're using the current tools that are free, you know, if you use it productively, let's say at Fraunhofer, if I use it productively with confidential information and I'm leaking that confidential information, which I cannot do, so I don't use it quite so productively at the moment. Privacy of users, responsibility for the content, right? So as a researcher, you're responsible for every sentence in a publication that carries your name, even if you have 7 co-authors. So can you be responsible for the content? What about as a developer? And the last one, practical transparency. So this again from the researcher viewpoint. So if you are required to put every prompt and every result that you had as an appendix to your paper when you use generative AI to create parts of the paper, that's not very practical, but it's very transparent. If you hide it completely, I find we're back to the problem with research integrity. So this is not a machine problem, and the person using it, but not saying that they're using it, I think that would not be very honest, would not fulfill the criteria of academic integrity.
Yeah, and there's not yet a guideline on how to cite it, if you used or not used it, or if it's even okay to use it at all, right?
There are proposals, but I haven't seen one, which doesn't mean there isn't one, but I haven't seen one that finds the right trade-off between transparency and practicality.
Okay. And so given that we've now talked about the challenges and kind of the status quo, and on a broader scale within the public debate, we've only been aware of generative AI as a whole over the past for like 12 months-ish. And now given that the developments are so quick and there's kind of, we're now talking about GPT-5 and we've only just started this conversation. Where do you expect us to be within the next 12 months? And or maybe what do you hope for?
That's very difficult, of course, because, as you say, the speed of development is very fast. One thing that should make us optimistic is the development of open source models, the speed of development there. So I think we can probably have very good results from open source models, which then allow us to use them and contextualize them for specific purposes and be more certain about what goes in and be able to test it more as well. Coming back to what I said much earlier about the contextual answers and the conversational way of interacting. So I think what would be very nice is if we can get a conversational interface to research publications. And so if you want to read a paper, you have a particular information need, and that information need differs for everybody, for more or less every reader. And so being able to rather than having the fixed publication in front of you and having to try and find the right information within the 30-page journal article or the 300-page technical report or book, you can probably get there much quicker by saying, this is my question, or let's say, can I have a summary? Okay, can you go into more depth on these points? And then, okay, this chapter I want to read. And what you currently often have then is, let's say you want to read chapter 10, but it builds on information that's in chapter 2 and 3, right? So without having read those, it's very hard to read chapter 10. So you more or less have to read the whole book up to the chapter that you're interested in. And I think we can have systems that are much better at satisfying the information needs.
Yeah, agree.
But I'm not sure we'll get there in 12 months.
Yeah.
I think we'll see lots and lots of developments. We have to consider all the other aspects, including environmental aspects, right? If everybody buys tens of thousands of graphic cards, GPUs, and then starts creating their own foundation models, that's not going to help our climate crisis.
That's true. And that's another challenge that we see, right, with generative AI.
Yes.
Like, how can we make it actually sustainable or somewhat climate friendly? Yeah.
So those open source foundation models might get us a lot further that way. Yeah. What other developments do I expect? I expect that we will see much better solutions for specific use cases. And maybe, one problem with, let's say, ChatGPT is that they need to train it in a particular way. They use reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning basically makes a learning system work on the basis of rewards. Right? So you interact with the system, or something interacts with the learning system, and then afterwards tells it whether that was good or not so good. So let's say you're playing chess. The reinforcement learning agent plays chess against some other system or person. And whenever the system wins, the reinforcement agent wins, it gets a reward of +1. Whenever it loses, it gets a reward of -1. Whenever it ties, it gets 0. Right? So how do you train such a system for large language models? How do you apply this? What do you optimize for, right? What is the feedback that you give based on? And in this case, it's language quality, right? It's not factual correctness.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that we're seeing. Very well argued, factually not necessarily correct. And I think we will see more use case specific systems where the optimization is more focused on getting it right for this particular use case.
Oh, that's interesting. And then one last question before I let you go. How do you yourself use generative AI? Is it just ChatGPT or?
I use a few different tools. I did use ChatGPT. I did use Google Bard. I used u.com, the chat bot, and there's one on medical systems, medical answers for Germany that I played around with. And for example, I used ChatGPT for proposing slides for a keynote presentation I gave a week and a half ago. I said, I want to talk about this and that topic. Here's the abstract of my talk. Can you propose an outline of slides to me? So I had ChatGPT propose about the content for about 30 slides for me. I ended up using one and then changing it a bit. But I had it also summarize a research paper that I had written with some colleagues myself and propose PowerPoint slides for those for this paper. And I ended up using quite a bit of content from that. And the nice thing with Google Bard and some other systems like that is they're connected to the internet directly. And so I used Google Bard to do search engine optimization for my private website, and ended up getting into more debugging. And it was quite nice because I said, this is my website, have a look at it, tell me what I can improve. And it went ahead, made some suggestions, and I said, oh, this is interesting, how do I do that? And yeah, you do this and that. I'm like, no, can you propose the code that I should insert into my website? And it did, and I fine-tuned a bit, changed a bit of layout, and then I went back and I said, okay, I did that. What do you think now? And it went, oh, great job. I see that you've done this and that, but you should also consider doing the following things. So that was quite fun. Although I did get to its limits when it came to like debugging some of the code, some other improvements that I wanted to make.
No, I get that. But then we can use it as a real sparring partner.
Yes.
That's
And
great.
if we get there with like proper debugging through such generative AI, large language models that are based on good systems in the background for understanding what the bug is, I think that can be extremely valuable to software development. Yeah.
I think so too. No, thank you for your insights, and thanks for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, challenges, or use cases that you want to bring to the task force, write us at TUM Think Tank at hfp.tum.de.